Detective Reginald Faraday had inherited more than a name from his famous grandfather. Percival Faraday had been one of London's finest detectives, a man whose cases were spoken of with admiration throughout Europe. All but one had been solved. His last, a daring heist at the British Museum, ended with 3 priceless Egyptian artifacts vanishing into the fog. 2 were never found. The third, a gold ring said to carry an ancient curse, was recovered in secret by Percival himself. No one knew that Percival had slipped the ring onto his finger, and in doing so, lost his life to the curse. His soul was drawn into the gold, forever bound to it. Percival's belongings passed to his grandson, Reginald, a detective in his own right. When he found the ring hidden in the lining of his grandfather's coat, he tucked it into the back of his pocket watch, unaware that in keeping it, he had inherited more than a relic. He had inherited the soul trapped within. At first, Reginald resisted the haunting, the drafts, the moving objects, the sudden chill. But over time he came to accept his grandfather's presence, grudgingly at first, then with respect. So long as Reginald keeps the ring, Percival remains bound to him. Together they solve crimes, the living and the dead working side by side. Percival lending the insight of a man who never stopped being a detective, and Reginald carrying forward the Faraday name, one case at a time.
Reginald Faraday and the Silent Bell. Reginald stirred at the sound of an incessant tapping. At first he thought it part of a dream or rain pattering against the glass. He pulled the blanket over his head, but Percival's ghostly hand snatched it away. The detective sat up and turned his attention to the window. It was still dark, the clock showing 4:30. "For heaven's sake, let a man rest," he grumbled. "The sun won't be up for hours yet." Again the rapping, sharp against the window pane. He let out a sigh, stumbled to his feet and made his way across the room. There would be no more sleep for him. A boy stood in the street below, half hidden by fog, his cap pulled low. When Reginald unlatched the sash, the boy lifted his head. "Beg pardon, sir," the boy hailed quietly. "The vicar sent me. He asks you to come at once and keep it close." Reginald dressed quickly, tugging his coat over his shoulders as he stepped out into the chilly air. The vicar, Basil Fenwick, would not have sent for him unless the matter was grave. The man was no alarmist. He was cautious, with words in both pulpit and parish. If he asked for secrecy, there was a reason. London was only half awake. Smoke drifted from a chimney here and there. Heroes clopped past with wagons bound for market, and the cobblestones were shiny and damp. Reginald caught the sour scent of the previous day's ash still hanging in the air. St Dunstan's appeared out of the fog, its tower rising dark above the square. A constable waited at the gate, shifting his weight and stamping for warmth. The boy pointed toward the door, then slipped away down the street. Victor Fenwick waited in the nave. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Faraday," he said. Reginald noted the crooked set of his collar and the dark rings beneath his eyes, signs the man had not slept. As they started down the aisle, movement caught Reginald's eye. He saw someone cut across into the vestry. It appeared to be a man, tall, thin, his coat collar turned up, his hat pulled low. The figure moved quickly, as if wishing to avoid notice, and he pulled the door closed quietly behind him. In the vestry, Sir Horace Penbury lay on a cot, a blanket drawn to his chin as though he were only at rest. Reginald stepped nearer. The colour was gone from the man's cheeks, and his lips bore a darker shade than sleep alone would give. He was dead. "It was midnight when I discovered him, here in this very room," the vicar explained. Dr. Hammond stood beside him, his hands clasped behind his back. He inclined his head in greeting, then turned his eye to the body. "On the surface it would pass for failure of the heart," he said. Reginald scanned the doctor's face. His eyes were shadowed and his skin drawn, the same tiredness he had seen in the vicar. "At his age, it is the ready answer," Dr. Hammond continued, "and it will satisfy most, but I am not content with it. There are signs that do not fit." He gestured toward the body. "Look here, this colouring about the mouth. I have seen it before in cases of poison. I cannot say it with certainty, but I have reason to doubt a natural death." Reginald looked down at Sir Horace Penbury. He lay still, his skin pale and dull, like wax left too long in the sun. The detective had never known the man beyond sight, but his name carried weight in London. Penbury sat on more than one charitable board, and his donations kept several parish works afloat. Some praised his generosity, others whispered that his business dealings were sharper than he liked to admit. He was spoken of as a benefactor in public, yet the talk in clubs and coffee houses often struck a different note. It was enough to give Reginald pause. A man like Penbury left behind not only mourners, but rivals, dependents, and those who might profit from his absence. "There's one more detail," Vicar Fenwick stated. "I cannot say if it bears on the death, but the sexton insists the bell gave no strike at midnight. He swears he was listening for it, and that it fell silent. A constable on his round reported the same. I should not trouble you with it, only they are both certain, and it is a curious thing." Reginald found it suspicious indeed. In all his years, he could not recall the bell falling silent without deliberate cause. Such things did not happen of their own accord. Someone had to bring it about. "What makes it stranger," the vicar added, "is that the bell rang again this morning without fault. The sexton tried it himself." A voice rang out from the doorway. "That's right, it's the devil's work, that's what it is." Reginald turned. An older man stood there with a ring of keys in his hand. His coat was misbuttoned, his grey hair uncombed. It was Mr. Griggs, the sexton. "The bell tolled at 11 and again at 1, but midnight passed in silence. Mark my words, it's a curse," Griggs declared. Reginald kept his voice even. "A curse, Mr. Griggs? Are you certain the bell made no sound?" "Not a sound, sir. I was in the churchyard waiting for the stroke. My own heart near stopped in my chest when the silence came. A man doesn't forget such a thing." "Yet it rang in the morning without fail," Reginald said. "How do you explain that? Perhaps you missed the toll." "When midnight strikes but bells keep still, a soul is taken against God's will." It was a rhyme Reginald had heard before, whispered in dark corners of London. He studied Griggs's face. The man was terrified. The keys rattled in his hand. Sweat stood out on his brow. "Don't ask me to say more of it," the sexton cried. "I'll not climb that tower again, not for all the wages in London." With that, he turned and hurried from the room. "Shall I go after him?" Reginald asked. "He seems badly shaken." "I'll see to him," Dr. Hammond replied, "and I must be going myself. It's near sunrise." He gave a short nod and followed Griggs out. Reginald turned his attention back to the vicar. "Why was Mr. Penbury in the vestry at midnight?" "He was a principal benefactor," Victor Fenwick said. "We had agreed to meet late to speak of the chapel repairs. With his schedule, there are few hours he can spare." "I shall need a list of persons who may have had cause to harm him." Reginald drew out his notebook. "Anyone with a grievance or who might stand to gain by his death?" "His business partner, Walter Carraway. Sir Horace was respected, of course, but not without quarrels. The two of them had words over the books. Sir Horace accused him of mishandling funds, though Carraway swore it was only poor luck in the market. The matter was still unsettled," the vicar confided. Carraway's name was no surprise to the detective. Sir Horace had a way of making partners into enemies. "Then there is Mrs. Thorne, who may have expected more from him than he was willing to give, if you take my meaning," Vicar Fenwick added. Reginald jotted the names down and added Griggs as well. The sexton had keys to the church and free run of it at any hour. His outburst earlier still rang in the detective's mind. He knew London was a city steeped in superstition, but Griggs's talk of curses had struck him as excessive, particularly in front of the vicar. "Has anyone informed the family?" Reginald asked. "His nephew," Vicar Fenwick said, "Mr. Lionel Penbury. He is Sir Horace's closest relation. I will send word at once." Reginald gave a nod. He had no dealings with Mr. Penbury, and little cause to think of him, save that all deaths left someone behind to carry the name. A sudden draught stirred through the vestry. Reginald's notes fluttered, though the windows were closed. His eye caught movement on the table. The flame of a candle bent sharply to the left, pointing toward the tower door. The vicar didn't seem to notice, but to Reginald the message was clear. He closed his notebook. "I shall need to inspect the bell," he declared, slipping it back into his pocket. Vicar Fenwick opened the vestry cupboard and drew out a ring of keys. "These will open the tower stairs." Beside them stood a brass lantern with a stub of candle inside. He took it down and pressed it into Reginald's hand. "You'll want this as well. The steps are narrow. Watch your footing." Reginald accepted them with a polite dip of his head. Crossing the nave, he stopped before the low door set in the tower wall. The key stuck at first, then turned with a scrape, and the lock yielded. A breath of cold air drifted out as the door swung open. The stairs curled up into the shadows. He hit the lantern. The flame caught at once, throwing just enough light to illuminate the first few steps. The treads were narrow and worn. He kept one hand on the wall to steady himself. The air grew colder as he climbed, carrying the smell of stone and dust. Each tread creaked beneath his shoes, and the close walls smelled of damp stone and bird droppings. A rustle came from somewhere above. Rats, most likely. At the top he found a small door. The latch lifted with a creak, and he pushed it open. The tower chamber spread out low and wide, braced with thick beams. The bell loomed overhead, its dark metal catching the lantern light. The rope trailing down through the floor. Dust lay thick on the boards, broken here and there by old footprints. Reginald crossed to a slit window. The sky was paling, a thin line of morning over the city roofs. Turning back, he let the lantern light pass over the bell. The rope felt firm under his hand, the wheel secure. He circled the frame slowly. A dark smudge near the clapper caught his eye. He bent closer, holding the light low. It was no mark at all, but a thread snagged on the metal, grey against black. Brushing it with a finger, it came away, soft like cloth worn thin. He turned the scrap between his fingers. A trifle, easy to miss. He drew out his handkerchief and folded the fragment inside before tucking it away. The lantern light travelled over the boards. A pale smear marred one of the beams as if smoke or soot had brushed it. Near the wall, a spent match lay where it had been dropped. Someone had climbed the tower with a candle, and not many hours before. Reginald took the stairs down slowly. In the nave, Vicar Fenwick waited by the rail. "You have been thorough, Mr. Faraday." He kept his voice low. "I ask that you keep this matter quiet for now. The parish is uneasy, and talk of poison, silent bells, and curses would make it worse." "I'll make discreet inquiries today, nothing more," Reginald assured. The vicar seemed relieved. He took back the keys and lantern. Reginald left the church and stepped into the square. The air was damp, the fog thinning. A milk cart rattled past. A man with a barrow pushed on, his head down. Otherwise, the street was still. As he headed toward home, he thought of the bell and the clapper. What sort of man would climb the tower in the dark? There was the sexton, of course. He had keys to the tower door, but the vicar kept a spare set in an unlocked cupboard. Someone else could have slipped in unnoticed and taken them. Suddenly, he became aware of footsteps following him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Then he slowed, and the sound eased as well. He walked faster. The tread behind him quickened. He stopped and turned around. There was nothing in sight, only the mist along the houses and the hint of sunlight peeking through the fog. Dismissing it as the fancy of his tired mind, he resumed the walk toward his flat. It wasn't long before the steps resumed. Reginald picked up the pace, his phantom pursuer keeping time with every stride. His footsteps echoed on the wet stones, sharp in the stillness. His chest tightened as he walked, every beat of his heart loud in his ears. Ahead, he spotted an alley. Thinking quickly, he took a sharp left turn. A rubbish bin stood near the wall. He dropped behind it and stayed low. The tread came on, slow and even. Each step landed with a hollow thud on the stones. He held his breath, keeping still. For a while, nothing happened, and then 2 legs came into view. "Detective Faraday!" a voice called out. "Are you there?" Reginald let out an exhale as he peered over the iron hoop of the bin. Griggs, the church sexton, stood before him. He rose to his feet and dusted off his trousers. "I thought I saw someone slip in here," Reginald said as he straightened. "Seems I was mistaken. What can I do for you, Mr. Griggs?" "Beg pardon, sir. I was headed to my cottage when I caught sight of you. Something came back to me, and I thought it might be of use to your inquiry." Reginald adjusted his coat and said nothing, giving the man room to go on. "When I saw Sir Horace last night," Griggs said, "he spoke just before he passed. Only a few words. His voice dropped. He said, 'Blood will have blood.' If that isn't a curse, I don't know what is. The man knew death was coming for him." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Did he say more? A name? Anything at all?" "No." The sexton shook his head. "What was his manner when he spoke?" "Quiet, not fearful, like a man who knew his hour had come," Griggs replied. Reginald gave a polite nod. "You did well to stop me. I'll give it proper thought." Griggs paused, then added one last thought. "If you ask me, the best thing would be to put him in the ground quick, before worse comes of it." With that, he turned toward his cottage and disappeared into the lifting fog. He lingered a bit before heading home. The streets were brighter now, the last of the gas lamps going out one by one. Sleep did not come easily. When the sun was fully up, he set out again, keeping his promise of discretion. By mid-morning, he stood at the door of Walter Carraway's house, ready to ask his questions. The house was a narrow brick affair, its windows scrubbed clean and the brass knocker polished bright. Iron railings bordered the steps, and a pair of potted shrubs stood on either side of the door. Reginald lifted the knocker and let it fall. The rap rang through the hall beyond. The door opened to a tidy manservant, who looked the detective over before asking his name. "Mr. Faraday to see Mr. Carraway. It concerns a private parish matter," he said. The manservant stepped away and returned a moment later to admit him. Reginald was shown into a narrow front room with a fire laid but not yet lit. Business papers sat in neat stacks on a side table. Carraway entered shortly after, fastening his coat as though pulled from some early errand. "Mr. Faraday?" Reginald removed his gloves and set them on the table. "Thank you for receiving me on short notice. I'm sorry to bring grave news. Sir Horace Penbury was found dead at St. Dunstan's last night." Carraway froze, one hand still at his lapel. "Dead?" "Sudden and unexpected," Reginald said. "I've been asked to make quiet inquiries before word spreads. May I sit?" Carraway gestured him toward a chair. "Yes, of course. What do you need of me?" Reginald took the offered seat. "You were close to Sir Horace. I've been asked to learn whether there was any recent unpleasantness in his affairs. Anyone with whom he quarrelled or who might have wished him harm? If this were only a natural passing, there'd be no need for inquiry. You believe something else is at work?" Reginald let the remark stand without confirmation or denial. "He had been out of sorts since his brother died a few months back. Couldn't shake it, and once or twice he spoke of a curse." Carraway crossed to the mantel and rested a hand there. "A curse?" Reginald's curiosity was piqued. The man nodded. "Said the family was marked. He laughed when I pressed him, passing it off as a joke, but there was a look in his eye. I believe he meant it." Reginald chose his next words carefully. "I must have a full picture of his affairs. If there were quarrels between you, I should like to know of them." "We did quarrel. Partners do from time to time." Carraway's hand tightened on the mantel. "It was over the direction of the firm. He wanted to hold steady. I urged expansion." He looked toward the window, as if gathering his thoughts. "That was weeks ago. We spoke again last Thursday and were on good terms. Whatever words passed between us, they were put aside." Carraway turned toward Reginald. "If you are looking for ill will, you might speak to Mrs. Thorne. She called on him often, and I always thought she had her sights set on his fortune. When it became clear he wouldn't make her an offer, she didn't take it kindly." "You have been very helpful, Mr. Carraway. Thank you for your time." The businessman inclined his head and rang for the servant. Reginald was shown back through the narrow hall and out onto the step. London was fully awake now. Horses clattered past, pulling carts heavy with vegetables, and a sweep's boy darted by, whistling as he ran. Reginald paused for a moment on the pavement, considering what he had learned, then turned toward the street. Mrs. Thorne would be next. Reginald was shown through the house and out into the garden where Mrs. Thorne sat beside a small table laid for tea. "Mr. Faraday," she said, setting down her cup. He removed his hat and took a seat at the table. "I trust I do not intrude." "Not at all." She rang the bell on the tray. "Bring another cup," she called toward the house. A maid brought them out and set them down. Mrs. Thorne poured. "How may I help you, Mr. Faraday?" "It grieves me to say Sir Horace passed away in the night. You knew him well, I think." Mrs. Thorne's hand froze on her cup. "Dead?" "I'm afraid so." The colour drained from her face. She pushed back from the table and rose. "I only saw him 2 days ago. He looked well." Reginald watched her. "It was sudden." Her gaze shifted toward the garden wall. "I dare say the gossips will have their say. They always do. They will call me a fool for mourning him, but I did care for him." When she had composed herself, she sat again and reached for her cup. She took a small sip before settling down. "May I ask about your acquaintance?" the detective asked. "We were friends," she said after a pause. "He called here often. There was affection between us. It was his kin who stood against it, his brother and nephew. They never thought me a suitable match." She traced the rim of the saucer with one fingertip. "I believe things had softened after Rupert passed. Horace seemed easier in his mind, almost relieved. I thought perhaps there might be a chance for us." Reginald leaned back, letting her words settle. Rupert Penbury, the eldest son. He remembered reading the notice only a few months earlier. Rupert had been a man of standing, well known in business circles, a familiar name at the exchange. His death had been called sudden, the result of a failure of the heart. 2 brothers gone in the space of a season. It was enough to make any family speak of curses. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Thorne. "In recent weeks, did Sir Horace speak of quarrelling with anyone? Did he seem uneasy or afraid?" She shook her head. "Not afraid. Thoughtful, perhaps, more so than usual. He said once that some accounts did not sit right with him, that he meant to go through them himself. I asked if it was serious, and he only smiled." Mrs. Thorne paused, then asked, "Has Mr. Lionel been told?" "He was to be informed this morning," Reginald confirmed. "He should know by now." Mrs. Thorne shook her head. Poor boy. He took his father's death hard, and now this. It will weigh on him." Reginald rose. "I am headed there next. Thank you, Mrs. Thorne. You have been of great help." She did not rise, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where Sir Horace had once sat. As Reginald passed through the French doors, a draught stirred, catching the loose papers on the side table. One sheet slid to the floor, stopping at his polished shoe. He bent to pick it up. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Thorne, the seal broken. "My dear Eleanor, I have given much thought to our recent conversations. While I value your friendship more than you know, I have resolved to leave the greater part of my estate to charitable works, in memory of my late brother. I trust this will not end what we share, though I fear it may disappoint you. Horace." Reginald set it back on the table. If Mrs. Thorne had ever hoped for a share of Sir Horace's estate, it had slipped from her grasp. And with that, he set out for Lionel Penbury's lodgings. The address lay in a respectable street near Russell Square, a row of tall houses now let as rooms for clerks, students, and young men of means. He rang the bell and waited. After a moment, the landlady appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Lionel Penbury," Reginald said. "Is he at home?" She tightened her grip on the apron and glanced toward the stairs before stepping back. "He is. Second floor front. You'll find him there." Reginald mounted the narrow stairs and came to a door left partly open. He knocked once and stepped inside. Lionel Penbury stood by the window, a letter crushed in his hand. "They have just sent word," he managed. "My uncle is gone." The detective removed his hat. "You have my condolences." Lionel turned back to the window, hand pressed against the glass. "First my father, now my uncle. It is as though the whole family is being swept away." Reginald waited a moment before speaking. "I am sorry to trouble you at such a time, Mr. Penbury. I've been asked to make quiet inquiries. May I ask when you last saw your uncle?" "Last night," Lionel replied. "We had tea together. He seemed well enough when he left." Reginald studied him. The man's eyes were rimmed red, his hair mussed as though he had dragged his fingers through it again and again. "Did he speak of any quarrel or of being threatened?" he asked. Lionel took a moment before responding. "No, he was restless though. I thought he meant to settle some accounts, perhaps with his partner. He said something about putting old matters to rights." Reginald made a note. "Mr. Carraway, his partner? I spoke with him this morning. He said their differences were settled." "Then Mr. Carraway has been less than frank with you." Lionel's voice rose. "They were close to dissolving the partnership. My uncle spoke of it only a week ago." The detective trod lightly. "For the sake of quieting rumour, I must ask, has your uncle ever spoken of the family being marked or of some curse upon it?" He turned from the window and looked into the detective's eyes. "I have already heard the whispers about the bell falling silent at midnight. The longer my uncle lies there, the worse the talk will grow. I am pressing for a quick burial to keep the parish from working itself into a frenzy." Reginald understood. A bell that failed to toll was no small thing in London. It was taken for a sign, an omen that something had gone against the natural order. By nightfall, half the parish would have their own version of the story, each darker than the last. "One last matter. Your uncle was known to call on Mrs. Thorne. Did he speak of her to you?" Lionel's brow furrowed. "Often enough. He liked her company, but would not be pressed into anything more. He said she was persistent, but he would not marry again." "That is not the impression she gave me," Reginald said. "She seemed to think a proposal might soon be made." Lionel chuckled. "Then she deceived herself. My uncle was clear on the point. He had no intention of marrying her." "She seemed to think your father was the chief opponent to the match," Reginald explained. "And that since his passing, matters were moving toward an understanding." "My father was protective of his brother's interests, yes, perhaps overly so," Lionel confirmed. Mrs. Thorne was in difficult circumstances after her husband died and set her sights on my uncle. My father thought she wanted his fortune more than his company. The brothers were close, and he did not wish to see Horace trapped in an unhappy match. He paused and lowered his voice. My father's death was called a failure of the heart, but I have never been satisfied with that answer. He was not a sickly man. I have wondered if it was something unnatural, and I have wondered if she had a hand in it. I have no proof, only the thought that both of them are gone now, one after the other, and she remains. Reginald wrote the words in his notebook. I have had to work for everything I own, Mr. Faraday. My uncle had the comfort of my father's share when he passed, a tidy sum, enough to keep him in ease. I dare say Mrs. Thorne knew it as well. She was often in his company after the funeral. There was a knock at the door, and a maid looked in. Mr. Penbury, the man from the undertaker is here. Lionel nodded. Thank you, Marguerite. He turned to the detective. I have another appointment I must tend to. If you have further questions, send word. I will. I can see myself out, Reginald said. I appreciate your time, Mr. Penbury. He replaced his hat and stepped into the hall. He opened the front door. On the steps, he nearly collided with a boot boy coming up with his brush box over one shoulder. Morning, sir, the youngster said, touching his cap. It was Alfie, a familiar face from Russell Square. Reginald returned the greeting and moved aside, letting him pass. There was a chill in the air. Reginald buttoned his coat and turned toward home. He had quite a bit to think about. There was a mysterious bell that should have rung at midnight but did not. Was it the work of a demon, the result of a curse, or something else entirely? And what of the sexton? He had overreacted to the night's events, and he had keys to the bell tower. Then the man had followed Reginald from the church. It was odd behaviour. What of the widow, Mrs. Thorne? She had set her sights on marriage. Was her affection for Horace real or a calculated move for financial gain? Before he knew it, Reginald had reached his flat. He set about making dinner, pulling a meat pie from the icebox and warming it over the hob. When the crust had browned, he carried it to the table and sat down. He hadn't eaten all day and was grateful to finally get a proper meal. Steam curled from the pastry as he cut into it. He stabbed the first bite with his fork and lifted it to his mouth, blowing to cool it. Suddenly, a draught moved through the room. The papers on his desk stirred. Reginald turned his head. Not now, he muttered. Let me have my supper first. But Percival was nothing if not determined. The draught came again, stronger this time. Several papers lifted into the air and dropped to the floor. Reginald sighed. You could have the courtesy to wait. A book sprang from the shelf and landed open, face down on the carpet. Reginald barely blinked. He reached for his knife again, only for the meat pie to slide across the table, just out of reach. Fine. He set down his utensils and rose. But after this, I intend to finish my meal in peace. He crossed the room and looked down. Macbeth, his grandfather's copy. He had forgotten it was there. Picking it up, he turned it over and skimmed the page as he returned to the table. Just as he sat, 4 words leapt out at him. He set the book aside and rose from the table, his appetite forgotten. The case was no longer a tangle. It had shape, direction, and an answer. Reginald knew at once who had killed Sir Horace Penbury. There would be no more quiet inquiries. If the truth was to be laid bare, it would be done where Sir Horace had drawn his last breath. By the afternoon, the vestry held an unusual gathering. Mrs. Thorne sat at a small table, her gloves still on. Mr. Carroway stood by the window, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. Griggs lingered near the door, his keys jingling in his hand. Vicar Fenwick kept to his place near the lectern, quiet but attentive. Edmund Harker, Reginald's oldest friend and now an inspector with Scotland Yard, stood nearby with his partner Seamus Callaghan. The pair watched in silence, there to hear the evidence and make the arrest. Lionel Penbury arrived last. His coat was unfastened, his collar loose as though he had dressed in a hurry. "Thank you all for coming," Reginald said. "Sir Horace did not die by chance. He was poisoned." The room went still. Gasps rippled through the gathered suspects. "Someone bound the clapper to keep the bell from sounding at midnight," he declared. The guests exchanged confused glances. "Why would anyone do such a thing?" Mr. Carraway asked the question others seemed to be thinking. "Before I answer, allow me to tell you a story," Reginald said. "There was a Scottish thane who heard from 3 witches that he would be king. He and his lady made it so by murdering their sovereign. Once crowned, he was plagued by fear and shed more blood to keep his throne, even that of a friend and an innocent household. His lady lost her wits and died, and in the end he was struck down by those he had wronged." "Is that not Hamlet?" Seamus asked. "No," Edmund replied. "God help us if Scotland Yard is letting you write the reports. It's Macbeth." "And what has that got to do with any of us?" Lionel scoffed. "Blood will have blood," Reginald replied. "Those were your uncle's last words. Mr. Griggs believed them to be a sign of a curse, but they are indeed from Macbeth." Mrs. Thorne glanced from one man to the other. "And what are we to take from that?" "At first I could make little of it myself," Reginald said, "but when the facts were set together, the meaning became plain." He turned toward Lionel. "You believe your uncle guilty of your father's death. You did not trust the doctor's verdict. You told me you thought the cause to be unnatural." "It was grief speaking, nothing more," was the young man's answer. "No, it was something else," the detective asserted. "When Rupert Penbury died, his share of the estate passed to Sir Horace. You were left with none of it. Your uncle held what had once been your father's, and he had no thoughts of letting it go. With him gone, it all comes to you." "My business keeps me well enough," Lionel said. "I had no need of my father's fortune." Reginald placed both hands on the table. "Let us stay with what we know. Sir Horace was poisoned. Dr. Hammond saw the signs." He pulled out his handkerchief and removed the scrap of fabric. "I found this in the bell tower," he said. "Felt, by the look of it. Whoever climbed up there tied the clapper with it, winding it tight so the iron could not strike the side. With it bound, the bell would swing but give no sound." He paused, looking over each of the suspects. "A deliberate act, meant to make his death appear as something unnatural. The man who killed him wished it to seem a curse." "Pure speculation," Lionel scoffed. "There's more." Reginald began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Carraway quarrelled with Sir Horace over business, but the matter was settled. Mrs. Thorne may have wished for a proposal, but she had no more to gain with Horace alive than dead. Mr. Griggs had the keys, but his terror at the sight of the body was no pretence. I do not believe it was he who bound that bell." He let the room absorb his words before continuing. "Why silence the toll? Because a bell that does not strike breeds fear. In a city as superstitious as London, it whispers of curses and souls taken before their hour. Fear leads to haste, and haste would see Sir Horace buried before anyone thought to ask what truly killed him." Reginald let his gaze rest on Lionel. "Yesterday you told me you had already heard the whispers about the missing toll. How did you come to hear the news so quickly?" "I heard it when I was informed of my uncle's death," Lionel retorted. "You have no proof otherwise." "Perhaps not, but there is one more matter." A smile spread across the detective's face. "When I left your lodgings yesterday, I passed Alfie, the boot boy. He was late on his round, for your boots had not been set out the night before. You were not at home, Mr. Penbury. You were here, in the tower, binding the bell." The room fell quiet. "This morning I had occasion to speak with young Alfie, a most observant lad, as it happens. He confided that when he collected your boots yesterday, they bore a most peculiar coating, bird droppings and stone dust." Mr. Griggs gasped. Mrs. Thorne nearly fainted. You slipped poison into his tea because you believed he murdered your father. You wish to avenge Rupert's death and take back what you thought was stolen from you, the fortune that passed to Horace. You put the poison in his tea before he headed to the church to meet with Vicar Fenwick. Blood has blood, just as your uncle said before he died. He knew it was you." Edmund Harker stepped forward and set a hand on the man's shoulder. "Lionel Pembury, you'll come with us. The magistrate will hear what you have to say." Lionel's face dropped. The fight seemed to go out of him, and he let his hands fall to his sides. When everyone had gone, Reginald remained a moment longer, standing up at the tower. London was full of shadows, full of men who hid their sins behind closed doors. There would always be another case, another tangle to set straight. But for that night, the bell would ring at midnight, and Sir Horace Pembury could rest in peace.